Good evening, Columbus community. This is President Adair, and I am calling the special board meeting, which is a retreat for us this evening on June 23rd, 2020 to order. Mr. Treasurer, will you please call the roll?
President Adair?
Present.
Ms. Beckerly?
Yes.
Mr.
Present.
Brown?
I'm here.
Mr. Cole? Dr. Pierce?
Present.
Mr. Ragland?
Here.
Vice President Reyes?
Here.
You have a quorum?
Thank you. So we have a short but mighty agenda today. We have a few key things we're going to discuss, and that is our strategic planning process going forward. We have Mr. AJ Crable from Council of Great City Schools who will be joining us and facilitating a discussion. And then we will also have a discussion about national perspectives on equity policies. Those are our two agenda items for the evening. Board members, can I have a motion to approve our agenda?
I motion to approve our agenda for tonight.
Second.
Thank you. Board member Cole seconded. Ms. Treasurer, please call the roll.
President Adair?
Yes.
Ms. Beckerly?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cole?
Yes.
Dr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Ragland?
Yes.
Vice President Reyes?
Yes.
Motion carried.
Thank you. And we will have Mr. Crable now join us on screen. And I will turn it over to him to lead us through item 3 in our agenda. Mr. Crable.
Thank you all once again for having me back. Always a pleasure to get to work with you. The first thing that we're going to work through this evening is trying to reach a place of consensus so that we can proceed with the strategic planning process. But in order to do that, I'll need to be able to work with your staff to go ahead and finalize the proposed process and put actual dates in it. So our work this evening consists of two pieces. One, to answer any questions you have about the proposed process outline. It's just an outline at this point. It's kind of in a template fashion. Your team and I have not filled it in because it doesn't yet have the entirety of your blessing. So the first thing that we'll do this evening is just walk through it and give people a chance to ask any questions or lift up any concerns, make any recommendations that you want us to consider as we go back and fill in the blanks and really flush it out for you to make it whole and complete. And then the second thing that we'll do regarding this document is identify when is the date that you want to completely adopt your goals and guardrails so that that portion is complete. And once we know what that date from you all is, then we can work backwards. I can work backwards with your staff to fill in the additional dates for the process as a whole. So that's what that's the first part of our work this evening. So starting with just the overview. So on the first page of the document, there's an overview. It describes phase 0, which is technically where we are right now, just planning for strategic planning. But then critically, what I need any feedback from you on is phase 1. This is the part where the board engages with the community and does the hard work necessary to really listen for the community's vision and values. And then once you all have heard those and written those down in the form of goals and guardrails, you take that back to your community, get more feedback, and then ultimately would adopt a set of goals and guardrails that would reflect the vision and value of the community. Where does the community want to see student learning go over the next 5 years, and what are values of the community that must be honored during the process of accomplishing those goals? So that is phase 1. And so before I move on, what questions, comments, concerns does anyone have regarding on the first page of the document, just the area labeled phase 1, where we are going? What questions or comments do you have?
Dr. Pierce?
So specifically on phase 1, I want to say it is the third bullet point where you have 1 to 5 value statements that describe the boundaries. within which the community wants. How much information are we able to use or glean from the project of a graduate to inform those values?
I think much of your graduate profile work is likely to inform the 1 to 5 vision statements, the goals, but some of it will probably be directly relevant to the value statements as well. But I suspect most of it will describe what is it you want your students to know and be able to do. And we describe those as goal statements. But all of that work that's been done is directly applicable to one of those two, either the 1 to 5 vision statements or the 1 to 5 value statements. Every single thing that's been done in that work so far is perfectly applicable to one of those two items. But I suspect the majority of it that I've seen will probably be applicable to the first item more so than the second one, more applicable to the goals than to the guardrails. But yeah, you all are already a step ahead of the process because of the work that's been done.
My
Board Member
second
Brown. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Pierce, and then Board Member Brown.
My second question related to the theory of action. How much of that is open for us to create our theory of change as we see it, or will we start with the framework and theories that are already out there and being used for best practice?
So as I've looked through all your documents, I didn't see anything that looked like a current theory of action that this board has adopted. Did I miss something? Is there one?
No, so my question is, will we have the opportunity to collectively as a group develop one?
Yes.
Or will we start with the framework that's already out there?
No, the first part of this work would be to lead you all as a board through that conversation. You all would take kind of the first swipes at it, and then you'd get some community engagement, get some feedback, and then iterate on it as necessary before coming up with a final theory of action that you all want to settle on. But because I didn't see anything like that in your current documents, my assumption is that you all will be starting from scratch, so you will be creating from nothing. Certainly as part of that process, I'll provide you with examples of other work from districts around the country, but I'm always hesitant to do that because what they've done may not be relevant to what needs to happen in your community. And so this is a process that really benefits from you all saying, this is what is true for Columbus, this is what our theory of action is. And my task is simply to make sure that it's sufficiently well defined so that it's actually useful. So for example, if a theory of action doesn't make it clear to the superintendent specific behaviors that would be unacceptable, then it's probably not a very useful theory of action. Ideally, theory of action is so clear about who we are as a school system that it clarifies these actions would never be acceptable in the school system to begin with. And so part of my job isn't to tell you what your theory of action should be, but to constantly challenge you to make sure that it is specific enough and clear enough in its communication that it gives direction to your staff of what types of behaviors would be out of bounds because they're inconsistent with the community's theory.
Board Member Brown.
Yes. I had one question and then another as you were talking, partly answered one of my questions, and that is, what is a theory of action? And I assume that when we get to that discussion, you'll have a lot more information to share to help me understand what that means. But I thought it might be useful to add a bit more now. The second question, after we talk about theory of action,
Board Member Brown is frozen.
So while he's coming unfrozen, what I'll let you all know is that I will put together a recommended reading list That will contain a few books and some articles that can speak more thoroughly to the ideas of goals, guardrails, theory of action, all these different, the various constituent components of your governance operating system. And so I'll make sure to, as one of my next steps, I will put that together and send that out for folks.
Okay, it looks like Board Member Brown will have to come back into the meeting. Board Member Ragland.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you for joining us again, Jay. I want to be very clear. It's your opinion that our work with the community, as far as engaging them and getting a response back from them about who we are and what they want to see, is not complete through our portrait of a graduate process, right? That is one process. It informs one part of what we're doing here, but we are not done speaking with the community yet from your perspective. Is that correct?
Yeah, so from what I've heard, you all developed a portrait of a graduate and went out iteratively to get engagement around, do we have the right document? Are we making the right statements about what we want our graduates to look like when they matriculate? That same type of iterative process would now need to happen for your goals, guardrails, and theory of action. And so in the same way that you would draft something, you'd get community feedback, you'd make modifications, and then, and depending on where you are in the process, potentially go back for a second round of community feedback prior to adoption. That same process that it sounds like you went through previously, you're gonna have to go through that same process with this as well. And let me explain why that's important. There are several reasons why you want to be really intentional about getting this amount of community engagement. One, we're talking about a 5-year strategic plan. So this isn't something that's going to just be on a shelf and live for a few hours. This is going to be what drives the work of your administration over the next 5 years. Between now and 5 years from now, unless the miraculous occurs, it's unlikely that it'll be the exact same composition of board, and it's certainly not going to be the exact same composition of administration. Like, you will have directors, and principals and teachers come and go. Some of you may choose not to stand for re-election again, and so between now and 5 years from now, it's going to be a different group. If you don't do the community engagement, then what you do is you position a strategic plan to belong to this board, which means as soon as a new administrator comes in, they want to go in a different direction, or as soon as a new board member comes in, they want to go in a different direction. You don't want this to be the board's strategic plan. You want this to be the community's strategic plan. That way, when a new board member shows up and they start acting brand new, you can say, well, hold up. Before we try to change everything up, we went to the community to get clarity that this was the community's vision and values. Before we start going off in a different direction, we would need to again seek clarity from the community to make sure that there had been some significant shift in their vision and values. But we don't just operate on board member opinion. We operate on a sense of this is the imprimatur that we've gained from our entire community. And so, as a method of ensuring that you have some continuity over time, you really want to make sure that you've reached a point with your process that there's strong community ownership of this work prior to the board adopting it. And so that's why I would say no, because you have done effective community engagement.
Yeah, I guess just turn them both
document, means that you are ahead of the curve. Like, what you create is most likely, your first draft is probably going to be stronger than any other board's first draft, because you're not starting from nothing. You were starting from a very recent something. But you will still want to make sure that you have pursued a strong degree of community ownership of the final product before you all adopt it.
Thank you, sir. My next question is about that process itself, because what you have stated emphatically is that there should be strong community engagement. Can you give us examples of the best way to engage the community in an unfiltered process that leads to the strength that you are speaking of. And I'll explain myself with unfiltered, because I'm being very intentional about that term. It seems that in the past we've gone out and we've engaged the community, but they have been community engagement within certain parameters, right? We had an expected desired end, and so we fit the community into the context of our discussion with the express purpose of them guiding us to an end that we felt like we needed to see. It wasn't necessarily an unfiltered community engagement process where the community got to express themselves without certain guardrails or guardrails is the best word that I could use. But there are processes that we can engage in so that we can get true community feedback, regardless of how hard hitting it may be for us to hear, regardless of how, it may not come to us in a package deal where it's really, really refined and everyone's using, the best language. It may just be something that's real from the community and really gives us an example. But are there processes out there that allow for that unfiltered discussion to occur that you have seen that we could at least look at engaging?
So as I'm trying to unpack what you're asking, I think there are two separate things that I think you're asking about. So one of those is, are we looking for community engagement where we already have a decision made and we're just looking for people to sign off on it? That's not what I'm talking about. That doesn't generate the quality of ownership that you need. You really need to go out with something that says, this is a rough draft. There's not some pride of ownership where we're going to cry if people identify something that we didn't think of. Like, we're actually here to get feedback such that there's something that maybe we didn't think about and it will strengthen the process. And so part of it just has to be, part of it is why you would actually adopt a process like this. So if you actually read down through the work plan portion of this document for phase one, that's why it talks about first we go out to the community to say, hey, here's where we are. This is what the data is. This is where we're at right now, and then iteratively work with people to scaffold up from there, so that people are actually not working from a final product from you, but working from here is the same data that we as a board are working with. Here's what we're seeing in the data. What are you all seeing in the data? And then building up from there. So that's one element. The other element that I think you might be pointing to, I do see often that there's community engagement that is not well facilitated. And so if you have folks facilitating community engagement sessions that just don't have the skill level you need for them, it can be easy for them to be frustrated by members of the community showing up in ways that are not comfortable for the facilitator. To me, all that means is just be intentional about who you select to facilitate things. I think some of them, it will be helpful to have third-party facilitation, whether that's myself and folks, or and board members from around the country that I could bring, or if that's a local team that you have there, an alumnus who does facilitation for a living. But I would, and sometimes it's going to need to be you all actually doing the facilitating. And so what I can do is, if it does wind up being you all, then I can provide some amount of training and coaching around how to listen such that you hear what is on people's hearts, not necessarily what is on people's tongues. That's one of the key elements, of effective facilitation. Is if somebody comes and I've I do a lot of facilitating in hostile audiences, and what I'm listening for isn't the anger and frustration that they're communicating. It's what is the vision they have for students that is underneath the anger. What is the community values that we all share that is underneath the frustration? But sometimes that takes a little bit of training and skill to be able to listen for that while somebody's calling you outside of your name. And so that's just a matter of choosing wisely who's going to be facilitating some of your community engagement work. My experience is overwhelmingly, even when people are frustrated, the vast majority of people are professional and respectful and when they engage in sessions like this. So I'm not particularly worried about it unless you know something I don't. But if you are worried about it, then just be intentional about make sure that when you look for facilitators, that you're finding people who have that ability to listen for the vision and values that are underneath the anger and the frustration.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Madam President.
You're welcome. We will go back to Eric Brown, who might just be here on audio, not sure.
Welcome back.
Well, this might work, but it's going to be an awful angle. And I know I dropped just as I finished asking my second question. So I don't know whether you've got that.
No, I didn't hear your second one. To your first question, what I said I'll do is I'll put together some recommended reading and send it out to you all so that all of you are leveling up at the same time.
Good. And if there's other terminology throughout this plan, reading on any or all of it would be helpful.
Yeah.
The second question had to do with balancing what the community wants, at least as we perceive that, versus what we believe as board members that have had some experience in this role. Ideally, those would be matched. I know you went back and forth a few times in the early presentation to us tonight about the community input and our input and making sure that the goals and guardrails are what the community wants, but there has to be some balance. So I guess how does this process allow for that balance?
Yeah, so actually, I just want to highlight, I'm using very specific terminology. And so I want to circle you back to the words I'm using. It is not your job to try to represent the wants and desires of community members. It is not your job to try to represent the wants and desires of various constituent groups. Or that is not what strategic planning is about. What strategic planning is about is where a group of representatives, in this case you, are listening for the vision and values of the community. So the vision and values of the community will tend to live at a level that describes kind of first principles around what we want for our students. Wants and desires tend to live at the level of issues. So I was the vice president of my neighborhood association. And so people will routinely show up and say, I want a stop sign, on my block. That is not a value. That is an issue. That is a specific solution that you have to a problem they're experiencing. So what I would ask them is like, so why do you want a stop sign? It's like, well, because all these cars are driving fast up and down the street. That's also not a value. That is an issue. And so it's like, well, why is that important to you? Well, because, we got all these people out here, and somebody's going to get hurt. Got it. Still, we're talking about an issue, a want, a desire. And so then I keep asking the same question. Why is that important to you? Because that's a safety issue for these children. Now we're talking about a value. People will show up and tell you, I want a stop sign. And your job is to get past the wants and desires of the issues that they bring to you and get at what is the core value that is behind the issue. You will never be able to address all of the wants and desires and issues of everyone in your community. That's not going to happen. Let that dream die. You will be reasonably able to identify and try to lift up and address the key values of your community. The challenge here is that in our living experience, we often conflate the two. Oh, well, my value is a stop sign. A stop sign is not a value. That is a solution to a problem. What is the value underneath that? The value is safety. So because as a board, we're committed to addressing the values of this community, we may put a speed bump on this block. We didn't give you a stop sign, but we still were responsive to the underlying value of trying to create safety by slowing down the speed of cars. And so putting a speed bump out there doesn't address the wants and desires and issues that were brought to you, but it does potentially address the underlying value that's been expressed. So that's the part of the challenge. This goes back to Jamie's question about facilitation. This is what I mean when I say you will need facilitation. You all will need to do this as well as anyone else you bring to facilitate. Why you need facilitation that is accomplished at being able to listen for the vision and values. Nobody's going to come up and say, well, what I want is safety on this block. What they'll say is, what I want is a stop sign on this block. And you'll have to get adept at listening for what's the value underneath of that. And so that's the only thing I just want to differentiate for you. You're never going to be able to match up all of the wants and desires and issues of your community. But fortuitously, that is not your job in this process.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go to board member Beckerly.
Hello. I'm wondering if you have any tricks of the trade in terms of how to reach into the segments of the community that often don't show up to these things, and how to tap into what their values are.
Yeah, this is important. So in the draft document, as you all again look in that first section of that phase 1 section, it describes two different things that the board will do. It describes outreach and it describes engagement. When it talks about the board doing engagement work, this is kind of typically what we often think about. The board hosts a big meeting, people show up, we have facilitators, maybe there's sticky notes, whatever the situation is. This is board engagement. But what's also described is board outreach.
Okay.
This is what's often missing in these type of situations. In board outreach, what it describes in the document is the board members think of where are all of the places where leaders in our community are already at? Where are our parent leaders already congregating? And how do we go to them to pull them into this process? Where are our neighborhood leaders already at? Where are our educational leaders already at? Maybe where are our business and community leaders? Where are our faith leaders already at? And so instead of waiting for everybody to come to you, which is a recipe for fail, in addition to having your own sessions that people will be invited to, you're also going to have to design a script, PowerPoint, some handouts, and in groups of 2 as board members. This is work that you all will have to do. In pairs of 2, you will never go alone. A board member by themselves is in bad company. So you will go in groups of 2 out to these various places with the pre-written script that you all come up with. I'll help you work through that. A pre-written script, pre-written handouts, pre-written PowerPoint, if PowerPoint's available. So say there's a interfaith group where all the pastors get together once a month for breakfast. Then one of y'all call them up and say, hey, we're going to come on out. And we've got a half an hour that we want to share where we are in this process. And then we want your reflection on this information that we're going to provide you as a way of getting your feedback. And so this is how you're going to reach people who they are not going to come to you. And this is a wise realization. Not everybody is going to show up at your house. You're going to have to go to their house. But that is built into the process. You're on mute.
That gets to a tier that we don't engage in or connect with typically. But what about just the rank and file families and parents? Like, is there any, because they're a big piece of this, that aren't even necessarily represented by the pastors, and our PTOs or PTAs in a lot of our schools aren't really strong. So parent leaders kind of don't exist. Is there
Yes, so definitely, I will consistently insist that you all, for processes like this with a community as large as yours, like if you all had 50,000 people in your city, then this would be different. But you're a little bit bigger, and so there's always going to be a bit of a proxy in that you're going to be relying on the engagement of grass top leaders, at the parent level, at the school level, things of that nature, because it's unlikely that you're going to get 100,000 people to show up someplace, or that kind of engagement. And so one thing is I would just temper expectations that it is valid to go to the leaders that your families, who they see as their leaders, who they see as representing them, to get their input as a proxy. That being said, if what you all want to do is invest in trying to get a representative sample of your parents, I think that is a reasonable strategy. Before that, that is not something any of you all can do. That's something you need to bring in a third party, who you give them access to your parent data so that they can identify what would be a demographically, scientifically valid representative sample of your parents. And then they would just go to work reaching out to them really one by one until they had a representative sample. So the reason this normally fails is because people think, oh, well, I'll just talk to the people I know and that's representative of the parents. No, it's not. So if you want that, if what you want is a representative voice of your parents, you can have. But the best way that I've seen to do it is you will have to pay for it. You have to bring in a third party for whom this is their business, and they can actually comb through your data, figure out what that would look like, and then just iteratively go out and make those direct contacts one-on-one with your parents until they get to a point where they can say, yes, this is data back from a statistically representative sample.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Now to Dr. Pierce.
Thank you so much for answering all those questions, because it kind of gets to some of the questions that I had specifically related to the timeline that you lay out for phase one. One of the questions that I have relates to week 8, in which you indicated the governing teams will lead first round of community engagement. I, like my other colleagues, are very interested in community engagement, but I wonder if we are oversaturating certain members of our community. We've done the Project Graduate. We've had, I want to say, upwards to 3 online surveys. What are you going to do differently in this process that engages them in a meaningful and authentic way, that they don't feel like it's just another community engagement exercise?
Yeah, so this is going to rely heavily on you all to identify. So, for example, I have no idea what you've done prior to this, because it's not something I wasn't here at the time. And so I'd be relying heavily on you all to identify who has been contacted, how are they contacted, what type of processes were used, so that if you are tapping into the exact same people for the second or third round, that we're not getting the exact same information. Part of this, I think, is handled in that you've already got this graduate profile information. And so the first draft that you come back to the community with is already going to be infused with that. And so part of the message that you're coming forward with is saying, here is a set of goals and guardrails, is a theory of action that we've crafted that are grounded in the last round of community time that we visited with you. We're coming back to you to figure out, have we used the information you've given us in a way that is consistent with what your intention was when you gave us the feedback the first time. I also like this approach because built into the whole timeline is ask people for feedback, go back, make modifications based on that, and then go back and tell people how you use the feedback that they gave you. So this honors that by saying, you gave us this, we took that and have formulated this out of it. Did we get it right? And so it won't be starting over asking the exact same questions. It'll be the next step in the conversation. But in order to pull that off, to your point, that's why we'll need to know, as I'm working with your staff to design this process, flush this process out, we'll need to know who have you met with before, and what did you ask, and what the process like, so that we can make sure that we are accurately turning this into the next step for those folks, as opposed to this sounding like we just didn't listen well the first time.
May I suggest too that as you work with our staff to get that information, they did take attendance. So if there's a way just to note, you know, here who attended the project graduate, here who attended these particular conversations, so we can then cross-reference and say, hey, here's the similarities we see. Here are the families that were represented in both of those instances. Here are the families that showed up for maybe one project, and here's the family who showed up for the other. I think that would be valuable in terms of helping us understand that we involve a diversity of our community. The next question that I have for phase 1 relates to week 3. You indicate that you will collaborate with our superintendent to initiate the creation of a root cause analysis and a comprehensive student needs assessment. I think that is absolutely awesome. What I did not see as I continued to read through the timeline was that information coming back and being fed to the board. How will that information be communicated to us? Will it be shared with us? I think it's valuable and important that that information is shared with us.
Yeah, so in the document that you're reading from, that's actually, I don't know, if you look down, looks like three rows later, 4 rows later, it says governing team meets to review and discuss data. That's where that's being presented back to the board.
So it is included in that piece.
Yes.
We'll see the analysis, because I would see that laid out, not in the form of data, but literally laid out visually to show us what that root cause analysis looked like. Sometimes data clouds and doesn't let you see the exact causal relationship. Does that make sense? Like, I want to see the visual layout of that causal analysis.
Yeah.
Thank you. Last question related to the timeline for phase 1. Week 15, there's a 7-day process of engagement. In this particular piece for engagement, you cite that you're going to accept written feedback from community members. Can you talk to, will that be a survey? Will that be open-ended questions? What can we anticipate that written feedback form to look like?
Yeah, normally what this has been in the past is just kind of a catch-all phase, at which point we're sending out a draft and saying, hey, this is the draft that the board is looking at moving forward with. If you have any feedback or any concerns, you know, open-ended, just send it back. And so when it's been done in the past, it's literally been that broad. Here is the product that the board is likely going to move forward with adoption on. What other feedback do you have on this that we haven't already covered? Now, keep in mind, that step comes after multiple steps previous to it that have solicited this directly. So that's just a way of making sure if there is anything that the process missed, this is a way of trying to just capture, you know, whatever we somehow managed to not capture previously. It's basically, it's a safety net. But that's why it's so open-ended as opposed to being specific. It's because we've been very specific in the feedback we've requested from people prior to this step. This is just, you know, to catch anything we may have missed somehow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Board Member Ragland.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you again, AJ. I'm kind of trying to think outside the box here. The district is aggressively pursuing one-to-one devices for students and the ability for each student in each home to have access to the internet so that the devices can literally work once we have them in the homes. Could this be an opportunity where we rethink community and specifically parental engagement? If we can get as close as we plan on getting to one-to-one devices, why could we not have school-based parental engagement opportunities on any given night, where, so we go to Ecole Kenwood for a Wednesday night and the entire school gets on a Zoom conference. We could even make it a social studies assignment for each grade level, maybe extra credit or something, but everyone gets onto the Zoom. We present them with a facilitated discussion. We've got a survey apparatus that we could use through the Zoom. The students will most definitely be knowledgeable about how to sign on, how to engage in this format. Is that something that we could do in order to get to an even more granular level in engaging with our parents and our families, kind of like a kitchen table conversation with the district, in order to get that real-time feedback from them and host a series of these? Maybe they could be facilitated and led at the regional level or what have you. But I'm thinking, if we're going to be putting devices in the homes of families, going to them is going to be a bit easier than it has been in the past, especially those parents and families who we know might not be able to make it out to community-based events. We're right there in the home with the device. We'll have the Wi-Fi capacity available to them. Is that something that you think we may want to consider?
Yeah, so I just want to keep reiterating, this is your process. And so whatever great ideas you all have for how to engage with your families, of what things resonate for your families, certainly better than I do. And so if you all think of things, and so I'm taking notes while you're mentioning that, that's exactly the sort of thing that would make sense. I do want to make sure we're clear. We aren't talking about work that I would be doing. Whenever we're talking about community engagement work, guess who the workforce is? Okay, just making sure y'all understand. So, because I'm happy to sign you up for as much work.
Right. Yes, sir.
I mean, make sure your hourly rate is, fully paid up. Like we so
No,
yes.
no, I get you. I understand that, but I'm thinking these are new ways.
Yeah.
Ways that we can get in front of families that we have not been able to get in front of them before. I think Board Member Beckerly made a very valid point. There are folks within our city that have been a part of this district, but not necessarily a part of our information gathering portions.
Yeah.
They've literally been disenfranchised. And so, hey, if we're putting a district device in their home and giving them the capacity to work with us, I think we benefit from using our own devices to get the information that we need to kind of drive this process. So no, thank you for your response. Duly noted.
Well, and the other thing, part of the reason this idea of using Zoom as a tool for community engagement was going to be on the table, whether you brought it up or not, is just because of where we are right now as a planet. There are going to be some people, they're not going to come to your meeting. They'll be like, you know what, I'm gonna stay home. You ain't gonna give me the Rona. And so you're gonna have to be prepared to have plenty of Zoom-based options for folks. And normally I'd be a little bit hesitant about that because, like, who are we leaving out? But because of the way things have gone for the past 3 or 4 months, almost everybody out here is figured out how to get on Zoom. Almost everybody has Zoom on their app. It's the #1 app, when you go to the app store. And so I think it does make it viable as an engagement strategy. Whereas if we were having this conversation last year, I might express a little bit of skepticism. But because of what we've gone through, it actually opens that as a door that otherwise might not have been open.
There are no more questions at this time.
So what I'm looking for then is there. It sounds like if there are no more questions, there's generally consensus from board members that you want us then to take all the feedback you've given us and go and actually build out and put actual dates to this plan and then bring it back to you all. Is that what I'm hearing?
Dr. Pierce.
So I do have another concern about phase 2.
So right now we're only talking about phase 1.
Okay.
Only talking about phase 1. Okay, so then it seems like I have consensus, from the board. So what I'll do is I'll take the notes that I've been gathering and combine all those together and try to build this out, and then send that back to you all so that you all can give the final version of it thumbs up, so that we can proceed. I'm pretty certain I'll be able to work with your team. They've been really wonderful to work with, so we should be able to knock that out pretty quickly. Hopefully have that back to you in under 2 weeks, preferably sometime next week. Not that you'll be looking at it because it's a holiday. That being said, the other piece of information I need from you all regarding the completion of phase 1 is the date. The very last item in phase 1 contemplates the board adopting the final goals, guardrails, and so on and so forth. So in order to put actual dates to this, I need to know at which meeting, during which month, at which meeting, do you all want to consider your work product for final adoption? And then we can work backwards from whatever date you give us to build out the process from there. So if you're going to identify a specific month or a specific date by which you all want to vote on your 5-year goals, what would that be? So some things to think about as you're trying to come up with a date. One major consideration is, do you want this to have an impact on the 21-22 school year, or do you want it are you comfortable with it not having an impact until the 22-23 school year? If you want to have an impact by the 21-22 school year, when do you all present the budget to your board? During which month do you normally present the budget?
We present the budgets, we approve it by May, but we present the budgets particularly February through May.
Okay, so in order for that to be influenced by this, then phase 2 would need to be completed. That's a superintendent's phase. Do you know, having looked through this a little bit, do you have an idea of, once the board provides you with their goals, do you have an idea of how long you'll need to complete your phase of actually developing the implementation plan?
No, but we're going to set up a meeting with you and our partner, Battelle, and map it out. But my hope was for the 21 school year, 21-22 school year, we'll be ready to implement. But again, we will take the time that we need to make sure that we do this right. But that was the goal, if we can meet that goal by fall of 21.
So if the budget comes out in March at the latest, if it takes maybe 3 months for your team to build an implementation plan, 3.5, 4, anywhere in there sound about right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, so then backing up from March, then we'd be talking about, then you would need goals by the end of November in order to give you the time to build out the implementation plan. And then by March, so then you could base your budget recommendations on the implementation plan that's based on the board's goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it sounds like if you all want 21-22 to be impacted by this work, then the absolute latest date would be at the end of November or the very beginning of December. We're currently we're basically in July right now. So the question is, anywhere from August through December is really the window that you have for this work as a board. So if you all were going to set a date by when you want to adopt your goals, when would that date be? Board members?
Sorry, I'm looking through Miss Nichols, our board liaison. Actually, I had her put together a calendar. And so I think we have it on December 1st. Misty, I think I'm reading that right. That mapping it out, that would be the meeting where we would adopt the final goals, guardrails, theory of action.
Board members, thoughts?
That's exactly the date I was looking at, given your 26 weeks of work in phase one. And believing that that made sense to get it done. Any further into December and we're into the holidays and things don't happen. But I think that would be about right. Make sure we do it right.
And then I think that also then I hope aligns with then what the superintendent has planned for the next step with Battelle. I think that's how we were looking at this calendar.
Right. And we'll go back again. We will have a conference with AJ and the Battelle team just to make sure we're mapping it out correctly.
Yeah, and so that I'm clear, my expectation is that the council will work with the board on phase one, and you have a separate team, Battelle, that will work with you on phase two of taking the inputs from the board and then turning those into a 5-year implementation plan. Am I understanding that correctly?
Correct.
Got it. Other questions about this or thoughts about December 1st, or if hearing none, I'm going to assume that means folks are comfortable with December 1st as the target date that we can build backwards from. All right, I'm seeing nodding heads, and so I will put that in my notes that we will use that as the date to try to build backward from, and if we can build some padding in there, we will, but even then, honestly, it'll probably be a little bit tight. The other thing that I should highlight is you all are going to have to demonstrate one, a high degree of flexibility, because depending on how things play out, with COVID-19, we may build out a process that has a bunch of in-person things that suddenly get moved around or pushed into online things. Obviously, this is what we've been experiencing with classrooms. I'm just highlighting for you up front. I hope it doesn't, but it could happen, with your process as well. We're kind of at the mercy of Mother Nature on this one. So that's one area of flexibility. The other area of flexibility that you all need to provide is, again, this is contemplating that a lot of the groundwork is going to be done by you all. And so I'll be working with you all to develop, for example, what are all the community meetings that should be visited? And if you all come up with 10 community meetings, and 2 of you, and you always go in pairs, you never go solo. So that means, we'll have a little sign-up sheet that has 20 blanks, to fill in. 10 community members, 2 board members each, and we'll need all 20 of those blanks filled in. If you come up with 100 community meetings, that means we're going to have 200 blanks to fill in. So y'all can be as aggressive as you all believe is necessary and appropriate for your community. But that's part of what I'll be working with you on, is building out, here's the work to be done, but you all are going to be the ones have to be flexible to actually do the work. Now, some of this work, again, will take advantage of facilitators. Generally speaking, a lot of your community engagement work where you're inviting large groups, then we can set up facilitators to run that for you so that you can just be more available to listen and soak it up. But for the outreach work, that's really where you all will be boots on the ground of being seen as the education leaders in your community, going out and leading education in your community. Side benefit, even though it is labor intensive for you all, it will build much more confidence and community buy-in when people are having this conversation on their terms at their meeting with your leadership and your clarity. And so this can work, but it is going to require flexibility on your part in terms of being willing to go out and hustle the work. So I have what I need to work with your team to build out the board's part of this. So going back to the overall, there's phase 0, which is where we're at now, which is planning out the work. Phase 1, which is owned by the board, which is where are we going? The board clearly articulates to the superintendent, this is where we're going, and here are the values that must be honored on the journey there. And then phase 2 belongs to the superintendent to take the board's work and actually turn it into a 5-year implementation plan that then is what she uses to guide her work over the next 5 years. It guides the development of a budget. It guides which agenda items she brings or doesn't bring. It guides any changes she needs to bring, and staffing patterns, all of those type of things would ultimately be inspired by this 5-year implementation plan that she goes out and builds that is responsive to the guidance that you all have gathered from your community and codified. So that is the fullness of the process. We've done your part. Any questions about anything related to strategic planning before we transition to a conversation about equity policy? So before we close out this conversation about strategic planning, any questions at all? The floor is wide open for questions or comments before we transition away from this entirely into a conversation about equity policy.
So I still have a question about phase 2.
So I'll refer this to the superintendent. Phase 2 belongs to her, not to me.
Okay. So specifically in phase 2, it's indicated that we'll have a strategic planning team, that the superintendent will solicit recommendations from the board as a whole, but the final composition is at the discretion of the superintendent. However, board members are not members of this team. Can you please provide the rationale for the exclusion of board members?
So this is the document that I created. While I can't promise that your superintendent's process will look like this, because I don't know what her process will be, that element of it, I would strongly encourage the superintendent to follow this view of it. There is a distinct difference between determining where we will go and determining how we will get there. And so it's important that the superintendent have a diverse set of voices and people that she's relying on for that. However, it's equally important that she experiences the full freedom to creatively devise a plan that she believes is most well positioned to actually accomplish the board's goals and guardrails. And so in my experience, that full freedom is not facilitated by having the people at the table who actually created the goals and guardrails, because what she'll wind up with is somebody who is there who, whenever an idea comes up, someone who is there who can interpret and say, actually, when we adopted this goal or guardrail, this is what we meant, not this is what we meant. And so as a practical matter, it short circuits her creativity process by having an owner of the goals and guardrails also there to interpret the goals and guardrails. Instead, what you want is for her to be interpreting the goals and guardrails and then to come back with a plan on how best to accomplish them. And so that's why I have that in my version of phase 2. But what her version of, but she's not bound by this. If I was running phase 2, leading that the way I'm leading phase 1, then it probably looked like this. But actually, she's already got a team that's implementing this. And so I don't know what their phase 2 will look like. But that's why I jumped in before she went, just to say I would strongly encourage there to be a segregation of duties between the people who design the goals and guardrails and the people who interpret the goals and guardrails. Sorry, I jumped all over you, Madam Superintendent.
No, I totally agree. That's the process I've done before in my former district, and you explained it exactly right. When the board designs, the board has to step out of the way and allow the superintendent and our team to be creative and put the plan that we believe is going to meet the goals that the board desires. So you explained it perfectly.
Excellent. Might I suggest that we not bury that aspect in the timeline? Let's be more transparent and clear in that. So again, as I read through that, it was kind of at the bottom. It seemed buried in the process. Let's bring that up to the front so the community knows here's the role that the superintendent is playing in this process and the strategic planning team. Here's the role that the board is playing in this process, and that we clearly lay that out at the beginning, so it's very clear to our community members.
Yeah. Well, and I think that part is on me. Is that as we're designing the engagement that the board's involved in, what I hear you saying is that on the board side of it, we'll have to clearly articulate, here's the piece that the board is owning, and here's the piece that the superintendent is owning. Because you're right, if we don't clarify that, then people will show up for a board engagement session and say, okay, so we're here to pick stop signs, right? It's like, no, we're here to identify is safety the core value that we're focused on. All right, so we're here to pick stop sign. No. The stop sign picking is phase 2. Like, you want to be part of that, go talk to the superintendent.
Exactly. Thank you.
Any other questions about the overall strategic planning process? Yeah, I agree. We include that in the talking points. And I put that in my notes. All right, so it sounds like your staff and I have our marching orders. Like I said, we'll go to work on this to try to turn it around very quickly so that we can actually get started. Simultaneous to going in and actually editing this to create the full timeline for you all, simultaneous to that, I'm also going to go ahead and just actively get started. And so one of the next steps in the process is me soliciting you all for what are all the community groups that need to be reached, or community leaders, building out that whole analysis so that we make sure that all of you have informed that, because you know who needs to be connected with. Obviously, I do not. And so all of that around the community engagement and community outreach work, I'm going to immediately start reaching out to board members and soliciting lists of individuals or organizations from you that need to be included in this, just so that we can make sure at the end of this process, we can look back at that. It's like, okay, did we get out to these groups? Okay, did we get to these folks? Did we reach? So that way we are being certain to try not to miss anybody. And so just be looking for that. Based on this conversation, I'm going to actually just move directly into implementation. I'll be reaching out to you all over the coming 7 days to start getting your input to help build this thing out. So let the work begin. That takes us to the second item on our agenda.
Hey, AJ,
yes.
Real quick. So I just want to remind us that we do have an Office of Engagement that has over 100 groups. I think it'd be nice to maybe get that list and add to it in addition to the meeting piece. So we're not starting from scratch. There's been a lot of work done by that group, and there's people there, and I'm sure there's people that they're probably missing that we could fill in the gaps and add to. So kind of to your point, there's a lot of work that the district has done. And so we're not really starting from scratch. So I just want to make sure that we are aware that there is a list that exists with over 100 names.
Excellent. Hey, everything that makes us more efficient and more thorough, I love it. So thank you for that. I've got that in my notes. And again, as stuff like this comes up, things that seem common sense to you all, I'm not going to know. And so as stuff like that comes up, don't hesitate to just shoot me an email or something like that. Do not assume that I know the most basic things. Feel free to shoot those to me. That's what I'm here for, is to help be a conduit for making sure that all that gets included in the process that you want, so it's a process that you're proud of. All right. So that takes us to equity policy. So let me start off by giving this high-level view that I bring to the conversation about equity. I literally just had this conversation with another superintendent in the council earlier today. And I asked her, kind of, when you think of equity, kind of what does that mean to you? And she said, well, to me, we know that we've been equitable when we can look at any given student group and all of them are experiencing success. That we don't see this group is experiencing this much success and this group is way down here. And this, like, when we actually have created a school system that is responsive to the needs of students where they're at when they walk through the door, such that when we look at the profile of our graduates as they walk out the door, that it's not this group's here, this group's here, this group's here, but that we're creating a system that is very effective at lifting children up, you know, to their potential. I said, all right, that matches my view of equity. What that view of equity is not is the belief that we're going to deliver to every single child the exact same thing. That is a vision for equality, that we treat every child equally, we give them the exact same thing. That's not actually a vision for equity, which is that we distribute resources in a way that tries to best match the needs of our students. What this suggests is that different students then are going to present with different needs. And so if we're going to have a conversation about equity, this is a starting point, is that we have to understand that any policy about equity has to be clever enough to differentiate between students based on the needs that those students bring to the table. That is not an easy task. Probably one of the school districts that has done a really interesting job of approaching this is a San Antonio school district. One of the challenges that they face is pretty much all their students are eligible for free and reduced lunch. So there's a high level, you know, of poverty in the community that their district serves. However, that it's not homogenous, that it doesn't all look the same, it doesn't all present the same. So you have some schools where the density of poverty have this many students, you know, per 100. In other places, the density of poverty is this many students per 100. And what they realized is when we looked at the data, that this showed up differently in terms of how well prepared our students were. That the way that we've always done things, the whole free and reduced lunch calculation, which by the way, was never designed to be used the way we use it, that it didn't actually account for this variance that they were witnessing. So one of the things they did is they went back, they said, let's set aside all the tools we have and what could we find that could best help us differentiate the relative level of need that a student brings to the table versus the resources that we're allocating to support that student. And they actually started using census data. They're looking at census tracts. They're looking at race. They're looking at economics. They're looking at family educational attainment rates. They're looking at all these factors, all these characteristics about the student to try to differentiate what is the relative level of need that students are presenting with. So that's step one. If we're going to have a real conversation about equity, then it does obligate us to be really creative around identifying and differentiating the need that our students present. The data is already out there. And that's why I bring up the San Antonio example, because they use census data. That data is already out there. You have the same data they have. You don't have to pay for it. It's already been paid for. Thank you, Uncle Sam. So now it's a question of, do you want to deploy it? Is it something that would be useful to you? Other ways of looking at student need, another district I'm working with, they've been trying to isolate the student need. In addition to looking at census data, they started looking at factors that were impacting the students. You know, how far behind is a student, and should we be allocating if little AJ is 2 grade levels behind, you know, and little Stan is 1 grade level behind, do we need to allocate more money for little AJ than for little Stan? Those are the types of questions that start coming up. Another thing that another district I looked at in their analysis of student need, they looked at school-based factors that were impacting that. So they included a calculation for how many different principals did a student have? How many different schools had a student attended? And they're asking, has mobility played a role? You know, if little AJ's been to 5 schools in 2 years and little Stan's been to 1 school in 2 years, should we allocate more resources for little AJ? And so this was the type of analysis they did. That starts to get a lot more complicated. But this is the first question I would invite you to dig into if you're going to be serious about having a conversation about equity. Because if equity says that we're going to distribute resources differently based on need, the first thing you have to identify is, how do we know what need is? And the only advising I've offered you so far is that relying on free or reduced lunch as your sole indicator of that is not as good of a job as you could possibly do. I noticed there's some questions. So this is the first step, is identifying student need and differentiating that. I'll come to the second part of it, but first, questions on this part.
Mr. Treasurer has a question, and then Board Member Cole.
Did you not like my characterization of your childhood, Stan?
Yeah, I think you're probably spot on. When you talk about allocation of resources, and you're talking about doing it based upon the needs presented by a student, can you speak to us about how that, I'm going to call it, new way to allocate funds relates to federal funding that has an issue of supplement versus supplant in it? Are they related? Are they in conflict? How does that work for us? For this kind of allocation?
Yeah, you still have to follow federal law. However, aren't you all 100% district? So it's probably not going to have a huge impact in reality on you based just on that. But you're correct. As you start looking at other factors in addition to economic factors, it is entirely possible that you could run into a situation where you're going to have to balance whatever your allocation formula is against minimum thresholds that are required by federal statute. And there may be interacting state statutes that I definitely don't know anything about. But I know definitely at a federal level, the good news is people have figured this out. And that hasn't been the biggest impediment. There have been some pretty significant impediments, but that usually hasn't been the one, especially in school systems where really we're talking about the overwhelming majority of our students. Like the district where I was board chair, I think like 96% free and reduced lunch. And so, so if we were going to reallocate dollars, essentially we were taking it from a high concentration, from a campus that had a lower concentration to a campus at a higher concentration, but not going below whatever thresholds were necessary to fund at the school with the lower concentration. And so that is part of the balance. Again, I don't know, what you all have going in Ohio and what kind of laws that they might have about that, but generally the only ones in most states that I've run across have been the federal ones, and those have been pretty easy to balance against.
Board Member Cole.
Thank you so much for that, Madam President. Thank you also, AJ, for your observations. So as a point of reference, very quickly, there are 3 different areas in which some of these things that you have already denoted, we've identified in the policy, and we're very deliberate and also broad in identifying those groups. It's the second paragraph of what I will call our narrative language, because one of my board colleagues, and now Dr. Pierce, does not like the fact that we've labeled this preamble. No, don't front now. Either way, I'll call it narrative language. So we cite, in accordance to policy 2260, non-discrimination and access to equal education opportunity, we will allocate resources to replace those inequitable practices, systems, and structures with new ones to ensure that we provide equitable education and environments to children and families, regardless of their race, class, creed, color, so on and so forth. So that's one section. There's another in which we gave a denotative idea about how we will look, how we will observe and evaluate and monitor, if you will, our world, this new world here. And we call it equity lens. This is the process through which we review any program, practice, decision, or action and their eventual outcomes, how data will be disaggregated to reveal disparities by student characteristics. Those student characteristics were aforementioned in the second paragraph of the narrative language. Then we go down to the implementation piece and those kind of guardrails. And I think, you know, Dr. Pierce and I discussed earlier today where we'd like to make some additions to that, that are around some very specific things around student outcomes, closing racial gap, and being very intentional about that, because we still very much aware that race is a seminal and pivotal government designation. It is. It is one by which every school district in the country that's paying attention to it very seriously, trying to close and make efforts and endeavors to close that gap. A lot of data, even that of Council of Great City Schools, is based on looking at this disparity and drawing down federal information for that, to that effect as well. So this whole racial piece as a major part of this policy is super important. But I just wanted to use that as a point of reference, not to defend us in some sort of way, but really to say that we're on the same street with much of what you've recommended. And previous conversations with you, Dr. Pierce and I had with you, you mentioned some other areas where we can intend to be more deliberate. And we've made that effort too. We'll make those language inclusions for presentation to our colleagues. But I want to raise that. If Dr. Pierce had anything else you wanted to add, love to hear it too.
So my question, I guess, and also a response to our treasurer's question, when we talk about the redistribution of those resources, is do we see any districts using structural economic models? In particular, I'm thinking about the work by Dr. Derek Hamilton over at the Kirwan Institute. He's a leading figure that looks at stratification and the interdisciplinary, or the interplay between race, colorism, and socioeconomic status. Do you see any districts that are, again, using his modeling to create the basis and the foundation for redistributing funds throughout their district? That question was, yes.
Was that for the treasurer or for me?
No, for you.
Okay, sorry.
I think that aligns with what his question is. His question is, how do we justify the reallocation of resources throughout our district, given federal and state guidelines for spending? My question or response to that is, we model our spending and justify our spending based upon a structural economic model that shows the interplay between race, colorism, and socioeconomic status.
Yeah, the only thing I would put out here is, let's see, I think his Columbus as a whole is like 30% African American. Is that somewhere around that? The city?
22.
22 for the city.
For the city, the city is 20, I think it's 27, 28, as you know, it punctuates, but 27, 28 is what they said.
And then for the school district, I think somewhere around 80% of your students are students of color, in the bulk of that, you know, is African American students. And do I have this correct?
Yes, 54.
So yeah, so when you are working with so the first disparity, you know, is clear. Like, you have this many students of color in your city, but this many students of color in your school system. So that, I think that directly speaks to your assertion that there is something about race that is at play. So I think that is an inseparable element in this conversation. Simultaneously, though, however, for this group of students in your school system, particularly African American students, not all of them are going to be experiencing need in the same way. So while their race plays an inescapable part in this larger dialogue, you will have to have a system of allocation that can differentiate within that. And so that is a necessary but insufficient characteristic to build your policy on. It's necessary, it has to be included, but it's insufficient, and other factors are going to have to be included as well to differentiate, even among this group, where does the greatest need exist, and how do we identify that, and how do we resource around it? And so, yeah, I don't think you can separate it. Like, to me, the politics of race are clear just in looking at the basic demographics of your city versus your school system. But that will have to be one element of multiple elements that are used to identify how do we most effectively deploy resources to meet the needs of students. So, for example, in almost every state in the union, there is one group of students who is significantly behind all of their peers of every race. I'm right now thinking of a group of students that I identify with because it's my personal history. That's foster students. That we are categorically behind all of our peer groups. If you look at all of your African American students and you pull out the group of students who have experienced any amount of time in foster care, I almost assure you that group of students is going to be significantly behind the full set of their African American peers. Another group, I experienced incarceration. It was a court-involved student, in my high school years. I can almost guarantee you, if you pull out of all of your African American students, the subgroup that, the group of them that are court involved in some way, that their results are likely to be significantly behind so the easy part here is to commit ourselves to equity, which is to say to commit ourselves to a differentiation, to acknowledging that different students, based on their characteristics, present with different amounts of need. That's the easy part. The hard part is actually getting into the plumbing to identify what characteristics are we going to rely on that tell us how we make allocations. That is a much harder job. What I can do is I'll certainly be able to refer you to organizations around the country where this type of conversation is what they do for a living. I can point you to other districts that have deployed these type of allocation systems where they've looked at what are the needs of our students in a variety of different lenses. A bunch of them have done it in very different ways, but that's going to be the harder part. Is either the board will kind of stop where you're at right now, in which case you'll say, CFO and superintendent, this is what we expect to see. You all go create it, or the board is going to have to get involved in that creation in some way. But somebody's going to have to build that. And so that's a critical first step in the process. We haven't even gotten to the other steps in equity. We're still just talking about the first piece, which is we have to commit ourselves to identifying need that's differentiated based on a variety of student characteristics. And some subgroup of the people on this Zoom call will be the ones designing what that looks like. But let me just be clear, race is not going to be your only indicator. You will not extricate race from it, but race also won't be your only indicator. But that is figuring what that is. That's going to be the harder challenge.
Can I just clarify again? So Dr. Derek Hamilton's structural economics theory,
yeah.
It's an interplay between not just race, but also colorism, socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
He models various factors in. So I think it really speaks to exactly what you're saying. It will allow us to model the diversity of student characteristics that we have in our model to redistribute resources in an equitable fashion.
if I can add to that,
Oh,
Madam.
hold on a second, Board Member Cole, because actually Board Member Beckerly was next, and then I'll come to you if that's okay. But before she talked, I think that this conversation just highlights the need to make sure we get this right, because we want to do this for real. This isn't about having a pretty flowery policy. This is about making a real impact to the systems of our district. And so I want to make sure that we do this right, and that we also include our new equity officer who we just announced today officially, because this will be a foundation. And it does come back to the money. Show me the money, right? Where does the allocations live? And so I know I was pushing hard to get this done because it is important, but I want to make sure that it's right. And I just want to make sure you all hear me say that, because it is so important. And I think that, the points that Dr. Pierce is bringing up, even about getting Kerwin involved, and looking at this a different way and how we measure, I think is critical to this discussion. So we'll go to Board Member Beckerly and then Board Member Cole.
Yeah, I guess in a way I couldn't agree more, and I'm not even sure if I want to ask this question because it's hours of probably conversation in itself. It seems to me, or let me see if I'm getting this straight. What we're saying is that we have to be really intentional about how we identify the groups for which we want to close the gap. Would you say that's accurate, AJ?
Yes.
Okay. And so, but it also seems to me we have to, that intentionality goes both ways, because we can't be chasing after, groups that are, have needs but aren't, or students that have a need but aren't necessarily part of a group that we need to be intentional about, because we would be chasing after everyone, or we have to prioritize it somehow.
So that's the next step that we haven't gotten to yet.
Right.
Which
and
is that once you've identified kind of where's the greatest need, the next challenge, and this directly relates to the previous conversation about strategic planning,
right,
is that my coaching to you would be to adopt, so you can have between 1 and 5 goals in the conversation we've been having about goal setting. And my coaching to you would be to have at minimum 1 and possibly more, depending on what you think is necessary, of those goals be specifically describing what is the change in student performance for this particular student group from here today in 2020 to here in the same day in 2025. So step 1 is let's identify how do we categorize.
Can I just? You're talking about in the equity policy, not in the strategic plan. You're
I'm talking about both.
Okay, but not the same goals.
I do not recommend that you have 2 different set of goals. I recommend you only have 1 set of goals. Your equity policy, as you all design it, will give rise to one or more of the goals that you establish in your strategic
plan. And the other one, okay.
Like these are related concepts. They are not separate. And most importantly, what you definitely don't want is a set of goals over here that are 5-year goals and a set of goals over here for equity. Because what staff will do is they'll pick whichever ones they think they can operate against, and whichever ones they didn't pick will just get left aside. So you don't want to start throwing 50 different goals at your superintendent. So you're only going to have 1 set of goals. You're going to have between 1 and 5 of them. And what I'm suggesting is, as you develop your equity policy, one of the things it will do is it will inform at least 1 and possibly more, depending on what you all think is necessary, of which goals we select for our 5-year goals. So it probably won't be this one, but I'll use it because I brought it up. So let's say that the student group that demonstrated the most need, that we feel like if we get it right for this student group, that we will have redesigned our school system in such a way that it works for all of our student groups. Like if we can design our school system so it works for this group that is really struggling, whatever we put in place that works for them is going to be great for everybody else. So maybe we say the percentage of African-American male low
Foster kids.
income foster, children, who are literate on grade level is at 11% in August of 2020. And we expect to see that at 62% by August of 2025. What you're doing in that moment is that you are clarifying, not that we only, this is kind of like the whole Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter thing. By saying that, by calling out this particular group of students who demonstrate this high level of need, isn't saying that the rest of our students don't matter. It's saying that until we get it right for these students, we haven't made it right for all students. That's the power of putting an equity policy into action, by causing it to drive your goal, your 5-year goals for the organization.
And is that in part because whatever you do to help those students will help everyone?
If you create a safety net that doesn't let, low-income African-American male foster children fall through it, ain't nobody else getting through it either.
Right. Very cool.
Because we are a slippery group of kids, man. We'll fall through a net. If there's a gap, we'll fall through it. If you can create something that keeps us from falling through, because this is fundamentally the truth about children, right? It's not that none of it, like, raise your hand if you never made a mistake as a kid. It's not that some kids make mistakes and some kids don't. It's that some kids, when they fall off, nobody goes to pick them back up. Other kids, they can fall every day and mommy and daddy going to take care of that and get them, oh no, that's okay, we'll get right back up there. I think we refer to that as at its most extreme as affluenza, is that, like, we get to this point of putting them back up that we've actually enabled really horrible behavior. I'm talking about the other end of the spectrum, where children, if they fall off one time, that could be it for them. What I'm suggesting is, if you create a goal, a policy that empowers a goal around that group, that you manage to catch them when they fall and get them back on, then it's going to catch everybody else and get them back up as well. That's what I'm suggesting to you.
And so you think that the policy should, let's keep your example of that group. So you say they're currently at 11%. We want to get them to 50% or something in 5 years. That our equity policy should identify that group that specifically and the goal that specifically.
At least one of your 5 goals, I would suggest to you, be that specific.
One of our 5 goals within the equity policy, or within the superintendent?
Strategic plan.
The strategic plan. Okay.
In addition, your strategic plan is also going to have guardrails, and so your equity policy could also inform the selection of, you get up to 5 guardrails that you'll select, key values that that the community wants to see honored, and so your equity policy could inform the selection of at least one or more of those. So, for example, you may decide that the thing that you want to protect against is the superintendent won't allow homeless students to be with, to have a counselor ratio of greater than 1 to 20. So for all of our other students, they're going to have a 1 to 200 counselor ratio. But for our homeless students, we're going to set a guardrail that says you can't have more than 1 to 20, because if you do, those homeless students, we're going to lose track of them. And so that's a way your equity policy could, now in this example, maybe in your equity policy, you're deciding to call out, homeless students, who are receiving McKinney-Vento support. Then maybe one of your guardrails speaks to that. And so doing your equity policy now makes a lot of sense, because it's going to inform, what should at least one of our goals be, and potentially, are we going to have guardrails that speak to this as well, that speak to what are the values that need to be protected as we're improving outcomes, for this group of students.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question that's going to make everyone mad at me. But so why do we need both?
And so the purpose of your equity policy, that's not a bad question. That's not a bad question at all. I could actually see, a scenario where if you all chose to, they could be completely merged and be one and the same. I suspect that you all won't go that route.
We kind of want to make a public statement.
Largely because I think you all just really want to move quickly on that. I don't think you want to wait till December to roll out your equity policy. I also don't think, I think you want to be clear about this as a statement that the board is making sooner rather than later. So for a variety of reasons, I think you'll choose to have them separate, but they need, but they need to flow together, where you obviously can see, here's this equity policy, and I can see how it's directly informing this that's taking place in the strategic plan. And right now we're on a path to accomplish both, which is part of why we're having both conversations on the same night tonight.
Board Member Cole.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for that feedback, AJ. I will say and echo our president that this is a seminal policy that we must get right. I think that in our initial work done with the PRC committee, we are on a very good track to doing that. I think all of the things that needed to be taken under consideration for the most part are incorporated into this policy. Again, where I think that we can take that extra step is to be a lot more clearer and directive in terms of what it is that we expect in outcome. This is a policy that is not in the weeds, but this is a policy that we strive to make very clear and definitive to the superintendent and all parties involved about not just making a statement. And I'm saying this for those particularly outside of this body who are watching. This is more than just making a statement. Resolutions make statements. This is something that we are asserting in terms of our power to say that there's going to be a cultural change that takes place in this organization from the date we pass it moving on. This is more than a statement. This is about changing and altering behavior and reforming our system to take those who have repeatedly, historically, been not accounted for as properly as they could have in our processes, and given the proper appropriations and resources to be successful, that now we are deliberately, intentionally considering that in everything that we do. With that in mind, let me ask this question to you, AJ. So in the implementation section, there's some other stuff that I think we could add to it, particularly that it's not just the superintendent, but that the board and superintendent do these things. But to that effect, we said here in the draft language, the superintendent will provide an annual equity report to the board describing how the district is performing on a variety of equity outcomes, including but not limited to attendance, discipline, student mobility, and academic growth. My question to you and even to Dr. Dixon, are there any other student characteristics based on what you've uncovered from the portrait of a graduate? Are there any other things that we could incorporate into this as those characteristics of a student? We, of course, incorporated some low-hanging fruit type things like discipline, attendance, those things which are vital in and of themselves. But is there anywhere else we could make some incorporation?
I would say, I think it'll be a great opportunity for the new Chief of Equity to weigh in. And we need to do some equity audits. We need to be very strategic in looking at our data of how our students are performing, and some other measures. Who is not doing well? Why not? All those other things that we know, we need to be very strategic, I believe, and look at that data and then allow that data to tell us what we may be omitting. I think that's important.
Yeah, the only thing that I would mention on that point, and then I want to comment on the previous thing you said. The only thing I would mention on that specific question, you said report to include various equity indicators. One of them that you included was student mobility. I would coach you against including any indicators that the superintendent doesn't have authority over. Because what you really want that report to do is show what is the superintendent doing to move the needle. So if you mean mobility by students moving from one apartment to another, she has nothing to do with that. And so holding her accountable for that in a report, I don't think is what you intend. If what you mean by mobility is how many times a student changes schools. She can influence that, but if you include that, then what you are explicitly saying is spend the transportation dollars necessary so that when little AJ moves across town, we still drive him back to this school anyway. And so if that's what you mean by mobility, then leave it in, but understand that is a massive financial expectation. If what you were thinking about mobility was students moving, home locations, then I wouldn't include. That's definitely that is definitely one of the student characteristics that might be considered, but that's not one of the things I would hold the superintendent accountable for trying to change.
No, I appreciate that. That's not necessarily my vision of it at all.
Okay.
My thought and intent of that particular piece was to peel the layer, and specifically in the areas of influence that the district has. So it's not just the transportation aspect of it, right? It's making sure that we're helping close the digital divide. All of these things that COVID have now uncovered that are clearly quality of life issues and quality of education issues, more specifically in our vein, for students and their families. So I mean, that's just one example of a few where we can have an impact on the quality of education for a child.
I know there are a few other, I'm sorry, go for it.
I was going to say, I agree, and that's a tall task, but I will say what my experience before, when we looked at our data, and what we immediately saw was how well our students were performing if our students had access to rigor. And what we found that we had many of our students that didn't have access to advanced courses in the school district. So we were very strategic about closing that gap and making sure there was equity in students having access, and that we had more rigorous courses across the district. So again, I mean, there are a lot of inequities that we know that happen. I think we have to be very strategic of how, in what part. It goes back to the strategic planning part. You can, we called it, just for the sake of this discussion, we called it opportunity gaps. And how did we, and that was a strategy. That's one of the goals, educational outcomes and opportunities. That was one of the 5 strategic goals. And under that, we looked at various areas of equity that we wanted to address. So I think, to AJ's point, that we're going to have to narrow it down, because as 7 board members, I know you each have a priority, right? And then how do we want to spend and utilize our energies? And will it be doable for us to tackle 7 different things in 5 years, and will we do it effectively? Because we want to be able to see the work happen over time and see some momentum, and we see the gap closing as we tackle something else. So I think as we get Dr. Blue on board, she starts August 1st. She can't start before August 1st because she's still in her district until June 30th. But on August 1st, we will begin to tackle that work, have the conversation, do some equity audits across the district, and hopefully the board, and she will have some input and give some feedback as you create the policy.
I know we've got a couple more questions, and I want to add the last piece of my policy guidance to you, and then we can keep moving with the questions. So first, you got to identify which students are we talking about? How are we differentiating need based on student characteristic? Second, then we've got to be bold enough to say we're actually going to craft a goal that clearly describes for a particular group of students, what is the growth we expect to see regarding their outcomes? What is the growth we expect to see regarding what they know and are able to do? Once you've done those things, you quickly realize that those are the easy part. The hard part is reallocation of resources. And I submit to you, there are 2 key resources that are the biggest levers for driving performance improvements for students that a school system controls. There are a lot of elements to student performance that the school district doesn't have control over, But once you walk into that school building, there are two key resource levers that the district controls. And if your equity policy doesn't drive changes in the allocation of these two resources, your equity policy is writing on a piece of paper that hasn't amounted to anything. The two key resources that will require redistribution based on your identification of student needs, the single most important resource that the school system has, by far, the single most important resource is the quality of instruction that you offer. And so your highly effective school leaders and your highly effective classroom leaders, that is the single most important resource that you have. And so if you're going to have an equity policy that isn't just writing on a piece of paper but is actually articulated with the desire to cause transformation in the lives of students, if we come back, if we take whatever this student group is that is struggling the most, and we look at what percentage of students in this student group have access to one of our most effective teachers and one of our most effective principals. And maybe today that percentage is maybe, of all the students in this group, maybe 10% of them have access to one of our top tier principals and some of our top tier teachers. If we come back in 5 years and that percentage is still 10%, your equity policy failed. Because what it says is that we didn't find ways to disproportionately ensure that our most effective, and because teachers are not widgets, then different folks bring different things to it. Like if you want to teach your kids computer programming, you can call on me and I'll probably do a decent job. If you want to teach them advanced astrophysics, don't call on me because I'm probably not your guy. Like there are some areas where I will be able to help bring greatness out of children, and other areas where I'm not so much. And so part of the organization with a vision for equity is first you have to identify who are our most effective folks in the classroom and in the building, and what are we doing to inspire. You cannot try to force people to move places. You have to have a vision for what could we do that could really inspire our most effective teachers to be disproportionately serving our neediest students. And so trying to force, I just want to be super clear on this, trying to force people to move, it has failed over and over and over. What you really have to think is, as an organization, how do we so demonstrate our values as a community, our values as a governing team, and how do we put our resources behind it such that we find ways to inspire our most effective staff to go and serve our neediest students. That's the first resource to reallocate. The second resource corresponds with that, and that's your financial resources. But I would submit to you the staffing resource is the most important resource because the difference that amazing teachers makes, that's the whole game. Like they are the whole thing. If you get everything else right, but you don't take care of this question about what are we doing about making sure that our neediest students are being served by our most effective educators, then all the other strategies you come up with will probably shift, but they won't move the needle. So this is a necessary precondition for causing equity in your school system. And then the corollary that goes along with that, again, is financial resources, because in some way you'd have to make shifts in order to cause that. But that's the last element that I would argue, if it is not present, if that is not a result of your equity policy, then we have a well-intentioned piece of paper, but not anything that's transformative in the lives of children. So that was the last piece I just wanted to put out there. Again, when you start to think about that and you think of all the complications involved in that, and you start to realize that all the other pieces that seemed hard suddenly are not the hardest pieces of the puzzle. I know there are questions. What's on your mind?
So I have first a point of reference and then two questions. My point of reference relates to what Board Member Coe indicated regarding the annual equity report. Those elements, the attendance, the discipline, student mobility, economic growth, provided examples. They were not intended to say that the equity report always has to include.
Gotcha.
elements. The second point of reference is that within our district, we do our best, Dr. Dixon, correct me if I'm wrong in this, to encourage students to stay in their school if they move. We provide students the opportunity to, if you move from this apartment to that apartment, your parent can keep you in that initial school. Do we still make those efforts? Has that changed?
So I could say, yes, I still hope that we do that. And I believe that our teachers and our principals are, but do I have data to suggest that we're tracking that and we know that is happening? I would say no. So I believe it's happening, but I can't for sure to say, you know what, Dr. Pierce, I know that's happening. You know, it goes back to this saying, you inspect what you expect. So, you know, and unless we're looking at it and we're measuring it and we have some intent focus on it, we just assume that that is happening. And I would say that, yeah, as a former principal in Columbus, absolutely, we were trying to keep our students in our schools. And I'm sure that our principals and teachers are doing that, but we're not tracking it, to my knowledge.
So then my first question is this. AJ, can you speak to the value of having a living equity policy? I think the whole framing of this conversation, the timing is that we have to get it right, we have to get it right. And not taking away from that, but recognizing that it's a journey and you take steps and you continue to refine and improve. Nobody gets it right the first time. The Constitution wasn't right the first time. We have a living Constitution, a document that can get changed. So can you speak to
Yeah.
Well, actually, Tina, it's really hard to change the Constitution. So I don't think that's a fair statement.
Well, you know what?
Also,
done it.
I want
They've
to
done it a few
have
times,
Board
though.
Member Ragland.
As a
I want to
political,
have Board Member Ragland
I'm going to stand
with
by
his
that,
question.
able to be changed.
One thing I will say on that.
Board Member
is-
Ragland, I'm giving you the floor. AJ,
So the question was
I'm
to
giving
speak
Board
to-
Member Ragland the floor.
We yield to Dr. Pierce.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Pierce, you have the floor.
The question was, speak to the value of having a living equity policy that can be refined and revised as we go through this process.
Yeah, so one cautionary tale to that effect is another district that I've worked with. They did adopt a mechanism for trying to identify the various needs of students and to fund their school sites based on that formula. And so they said, instead of the normal way of funding schools, which is, well, the number of students you have dictates how many teachers will send you and how many counselors will send you and how many, does this sound familiar? Yeah, so that's kind of the normal way of funding schools. And so this school system said, we're not going to fund it that way anymore, because that doesn't actually cause equity that we're looking for. The way we're going to fund it instead is we're going to identify students by need, and then we're going to send funding to schools on a weighted student funding formula based on that. And so this was part of their effort to achieve equity. The challenge they ran into is they cooked it into the policy, and then everybody kind of forgot about it, and it never got changed. Well, about 10 years later, I come along and I'm looking at their policies, and I'm looking at what they adopted, and I'm pretty certain the weighting system that they adopted at the time, 10 years prior, was probably a spot on match with the needs in their school system. But guess what wasn't true today? Because they hadn't updated it, it was the equity section of their policy was unintentionally locking in place an inequitable distribution of resources because it simply hadn't been updated. And so that's just a cautionary tale, is that as you do this work, you will have to come back and revisit it. I'd recommend a minimum. Just expect that every time you redo your 5-year strategic plan, you're going to have to redesign any type of weights that go along with this at minimum. If you have a massive demographic shift somewhere in that period, you may have to do it in between. So I know a school system, they went from not being a site that hosted many refugee families and asylees, to being a site where the federal government was sending a lot. And they needed to stop and think, whoa, wait a minute, we had not calibrated our resources around this additional student group. And so they had to go back and redesign it. But generally speaking, at minimum, my recommendation is you're going to have to revisit this to make sure it's calibrated appropriately every 5 years.
And I would like to add that I know, and again, I can only speak from experience, when we did our policy in my former district, I think of all the work that I've done, that was one of the top 5, top 3 by far the hardest, Dr. Pierce. When you're talking about tough conversations, I mean, I get teary-eyed just even thinking about it right now. It was tough. And it was something that I would say that was so important to me that we got it right and that we had those tough conversations, and that that people who needed to go home mad or cry and wrestle with it, we had to. And so I don't know the time that it takes for each community, but I know that community, it took a while, because people had to wrestle with beliefs and wrestle with what had happened in their district for so long, and wrestle with how do we undo things that families had benefited from, even some of the board members' families had benefited from. And
How's she telling it?
How did we have those conversations with city officials and training? It was so tough. And so I just offer for us, if we're serious about it, do we take the time to get it right? Because once it's in place, you know, they're saying you go slow to go fast. Then the board says, okay, this is it. Then Talisa, we want an equity audit where that can happen in spite of the policy. But we want it reported to the board, quarterly on this. We even took it one step further and had it part of the negotiated agreement, because we were so intently focused on making sure that staff had equity policy. So when we talk about this, and when we say who we are as a district, I don't want us to say that we're about equity in 100 different things, right? It's like we are about this, and this is how we define it. And it could be very different from any other district and how they define it, because we have talked to our constituents, we've had those tough conversations and those hard conversations ourselves, and we looked at our data. Our data would show us where we are broken. It would clearly show us, and it would show us what we need to focus on first. And sometimes you have to focus on what's happening inside your organization first and remedy that, and then move outside to the next layer and to the next layer, so that doesn't continue to happen again within the organization. And this organization is 10 times larger than my former organization. I just say that we are what we have so far is good. And you guys have done a great job putting it together. And if we need to reflect and get more input, look at some more data, whatever we need to do, let's do it, and just make sure that we have the policy that we're all proud of when we move it forward, because people are looking. This is the first time this district has had a chief of equity that's sitting at the cabinet level. People are looking. We've already talked to OSU and other partners that are looking to help us lift this work, to see us as a national model of this work. And however long it takes us to put it together, let's commit to doing that.
So again, that question wasn't intended to, I feel like there's some underlining assumptions around the timing and when we're doing this. The question was to point to the fact that it should be a living document, that we revise, that we're intentional about going back every couple of years to say, how are we doing? Are we closing these gaps? That's what a living document means in terms of how I asked that question.
Quarterly, Pierce. You can say quarterly in your policy. You can say report out quarterly. We report out quarterly. I think that's perfect. And we bring it back. It's something that's on the agenda for the board and for the community.
Okay, I just want to make sure we have a time check here. We're past 7:30, which is past our allotted time. And I know that Board Member Ragland and Board Member Beckerly have comments. So I'd like, if AJ's okay with that, go ahead and let them ask their questions and then close the meeting. This is obviously not the end of this discussion by no means. We have a lot of work that I think we still need to do, and we will continue discussing this. But for this evening, I think we need to respect AJ's time and close the meeting. So I'll turn it to Board Member Ragland.
Thank you, Madam President. My first question is to you around process. We just passed the first reading of the equity policy last week. Was it your intention to bring this back up for a second reading at our June 30th meeting? And if so, hearing the discussion tonight, would it be beneficial to offer a motion to table the discussion on the equity policy in lieu of tonight's discussion and progress towards what we feel is a more comprehensive look at the policy?
Yes, I agree with that as an individual, Board Member Ragland.
In that case, I move that we table the discussion.
Well, you don't, it's just, we can do that at the meeting.
Okay, thank you. My next question, Dr. Dixon, you mentioned an equity audit several times now. Can you give us some specific questions that an equity audit might ask and really some objectives to an equity audit? If you've, I mean, obviously you've had experience with that, but kind of give us a little bit more detailed information about what that looks like. And then I have another two questions after that, President Adair. Thank you.
Thank you. So one question could be, do students have access to all classes that are offered in the school district? A simple question like that. Another question, how do we allocate our resources? And resources can be staff. Do our staff members, do they go to the student, or staff members assigned to the schools where the students that have the most need? Another question can be, how do we give our budget? We have a equity, we do in our district, fortunately. We have an allocation that we give school buildings that have additional needs, so they get additional resources. So those are types of questions that are in the equity audit.
Thank you, Madam Superintendent. My next question really is for AJ. You mentioned the distribution of talent as a driver to any effective equity policy. We have just recently gotten through a curriculum audit in which some of the contractual guidelines that we have were articulated as very doing some of the things that you've kind of described. Can you give us some examples of maybe districts that work through some of those contractual challenges in order to move staff into places, even despite the fact that the contract may say one thing, but that requires something completely different? Are there examples of where districts have come together with collective bargaining units and done something in mid-contract that allows for the needs of the students to be better articulated and acted upon, I guess?
I'm sure there are examples of that. I'm not personally familiar with that, largely because the places I am familiar with that have had the most success with this didn't have success as a result of changing the district's right to move teachers. So this goes back to what I said earlier, is that pretty much every district I've seen that has tried to make this happen by force has failed. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. And so this is a leadership opportunity, not a forcefulness opportunity. That you have to create the conditions such that one, you've identified who your most effective educators are, both at the campus leadership level as well as the school leadership level as well as the classroom leadership level. And then you have to cause the conditions to be such that your more effective folks are disproportionately running to be in a position to be able to serve your students with the greatest need. But you can't force your way into that happening. You have to leadership your way into that happening. And so that is something that is something that that you all are going to have to design. And I've seen different places pull this off, and they've all used slightly different approaches. Probably the most common thing among them is that if I am a highly effective teacher, I will take a $5,000 pay cut to get away from a crazy ineffective principal. So you will never be able to pay people enough money to deal with foolishness. That just is not how things work. And so if you think you can force people, to move, that's not going to work. If you think you can just throw enough money out there to get people to move, that's from what I've seen also not going to work. You're going to have to create the conditions where your most effective staff, are seeing it as experiencing it as an opportunity to go be of service to your students, and who you will have to be and what you will have to change about your organization to cause that to be the case. I mean, that is the leadership challenge that confronts you. But there is no forcefulness way out of it, and you cannot buy your way out of it. I think money will have to play a factor, but money will not solve this. Money by itself will not solve this. This is a leadership challenge, and you will have to come up with a leadership solution to cause your students with the greatest needs to be attractive, even when they're a pack of little AJs who are unholy terrors. I'm very confident I was suspended more in my K-12 experience than everybody on this conference call combined. And yet there were some amazing teachers who put up with my little bad attitude, reached me, and all of a sudden had me pursuing what I was capable of rather than just what I'd shown up as. That's the difference an amazing teacher can make. That's the reason I get to be on this conference call with you right now. And that is the reason that God's blessing was made manifest in my life through the form of some really awesome foster parents from 0 to 5 and some really amazing teachers from K through 12. And that is a story of why I'm here. Not because I was smart, it's because amazing teachers were placed in my path. What I'm saying is you all can be the cause of that blessing on behalf of children by causing amazing teachers to be in the path of children who need it the most. But yeah, you're not going to be able to force your way through it, and you're not going, and money alone won't get you there. It'll be a leadership challenge. But I can certainly point you to various districts that have taken it on as a leadership approach and show you the results they got. And I can show you other districts who saw what they did and just did the financial portion, thinking that would be enough, but didn't do the leadership portion, and wasted all that money that when the final data came back, didn't make a bit of difference in the lives of students. One thing that I don't know about, and so you all will need to, and so part of the ramification of what I'm describing is I'm making the assumption that you know who your most effective principals are. That assumption may not hold, I don't know. I'm making the assumption that you know who your most effective teachers are. That assumption may not, I don't know, because I don't know your internal systems. But if those assumptions don't hold, then that is a challenge that your equity policy will need to overcome. Otherwise, your equity policy, frankly, won't be worth the paper it's written on.
Thank you for that. I know we have plenty of amazing teachers and principals by which we
No doubt.
we get the job done. And so we've got a good cadre of folks to choose from already. So that's good to know. My last question is regarding language within the policy itself. You have been very specific regarding specific subgroups in your explanation of what an effective policy looks like. Our policy uses very broad terms in its description of those subgroups that have been disenfranchised. In fact, there's only one place in the policy that mentions any particular subgroups with specificity. That's in the equity lens, and it's really more of an example and not necessarily something that's intentional toward those particular subgroups. But what you've described to us as an effective policy is something that is very granular, down to the specific subgroup and specific categories. As we look at what is happening on the streets right now of our country, and we work within our policy, understanding the diversity, the great diversity that exists within Columbus, I think one of the things we've tried to do with our policy is make sure that we're catching everybody. But in doing that, it might water the policy down to where we might not meet the needs of those that need the most, the most support. How do we balance that? Because there are competing interests really within many equity policies, and it almost seems as if attention being given to one particular subgroup draws away from attention being given to other more powerful, more organized subgroups.
Yeah. So basically, you just messed around and answered your question. So I am clearly not necessary for this conversation. So basically, let me recap for the people who didn't catch what just happened. The question was, everywhere else you talk about having these broad policies, but in this area you talk about having a very specific granular policy. Why the change, AJ? The rhetoric seems to shift up. Is it because in this particular area, if we aren't granular, the forces that be will push back and cause these things not to come to fruition? So basically, this is the nature of policy anywhere, is that my recommendation to you is always to have the broadest, highest level policy, but wherever the board stops, the superintendent and staff start. And so if you have a really high level broad policy, which is what I generally recommend you have, then that creates a lot of freedom for the superintendent to interpret and to take action. However, in some specific instances, of the power, as you describe it, the powers that be, the norms that exist in your community are not aligned with the policy direction you're choosing. In those circumstances, I recommend the board be much more granular in its approach, specifically to create a hedge of protection around your superintendent. So then when she goes out to do what she is now directed to do, people say, hey, we don't want, Dr. Dixon, we don't want you doing this. We want you to stop. She's like, look, this is tough stuff, but this is what the board's telling me I got to do. And so instead of her being out there on a limb by herself trying to fight for children, she is out there as a direct result of her boss, the board, right, telling her this is the fight that you need to be in. That is why in some areas you would want to be very, very, very granular and specific, because that is your way of creating protection for your board, for your superintendent to go out and fight for your children on your behalf. In most places, you want to stick with broad policy to give her freedom. But where she's going to be confronted in the community, but you still want her to persist nevertheless, your job is to take the hit for your superintendent by putting it in black and white.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Madam President.
Answering your own questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, AJ, for spending the time with us this evening. And we know that we have a lot more meetings with you in the future. And I think I'm excited for both our strategic kind of planning process as well as really getting this equity policy right. And we just appreciate you spending this time with us. Just as a reminder to everyone, AJ is part of the Council of Great City Schools. And as a member of that organization, we get to utilize these services, which are of benefit to our entire district. So again, thank you, Council. Thank you, AJ, and thank you, board members, for having an amazing discussion tonight that we will continue. So at this time, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Mr. Treasurer, please call the roll.
Ms. Beckerly,
Yes.
Mr. Brown,
Yes.
Mr. Cole,
Yes.
Dr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Ragland,
Yes.
Vice President Reyes,
Yes.
President Adair.
Yes.
That motion carried.
Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.